evaluating sort of science engagement. I've been evaluating science engagement activities for probably over 20 years or so got a fair bit of kind of practical experience on that. So what I wanted to do was just really share a few thoughts in terms of some like ideas that I find helpful when I'm thinking about evaluation. So I think I should probably just start with what I think about evaluation. For me, evaluation is kind of, it's a little bit about kind of how I do lots of things, like everything. Like so I definitely have a reflective practice mindset, and so I was introduced to the idea of reflective practice over 20 years ago when I did my master's course here in the UK, and that's become a real kind of linchpin and kind of approach to how I work in general. So for me, evaluation isn't something that's an additional thing to do. It's kind of how I operate. And when I'm thinking about evaluation, then I like to think about front end, formative and summative. So if you're thinking about evaluation, quite often we tend to think about the summative, the stuff that we do at the end. But like I say, I'm a fan of evaluation and as a kind of embedded process. So for me, it's something that starts at the beginning of a project where we do some front end work to see what's out there. We do formative work as we're developing our initiatives and ideas, and then we do summative work at the end. And what I will say is what I want to do is just share a few ideas over the next few minutes. And what I'll do is I've got quite a few links and things to support some of the things I'll be talking about. So we'll share those afterwards or in the chat if I have time to manage that as well as we're going. So I'm just going to sort of drop a few things there, and perhaps you can, if you want to hear more about them, we can talk about them later on in the session. And the question, of course, then is why do we evaluate? Well, I quite like that if you want to look at the user-friendly handbook for project evaluation, Joy Freckling-Vestadt says, to understand the worth and merit of our products and services, which I quite like. It's a bit of a catch-all term. But for me, evaluation is definitely, what I want to do is go, have I done what I set out to do? Have I done the thing that I thought I was going to do? And why is it? Why? How have I managed to achieve that? So I sort of think about outcome evaluation, so the changes and benefits to the people involved, and then process evaluation. So thinking about why, what's the thing that we have done that has meant that we've managed to achieve our goals. And when we're thinking about the first one, outcome evaluation, I often want to think about who's attending our events, who's participating, and what are the changes that what have we achieved for them. And in terms of that, thinking about who's attending, that's one of my great kind of passions, I suppose, is thinking about a concept called segmentation. I don't know if that's something that you're familiar with, but we can unpack that more if you like. But essentially, it's an idea that we are not all the same, we're not homogenous, but we can cluster into groups of people that are similar. And I find it a really helpful model. It gets beyond perhaps some of the usual ways. I don't know what it's like where you are, but you know, years ago, I would always just go, who's my target audience? Oh, it's families with kids aged 4 to 14. But that doesn't tell you anything about their current kind of knowledge or attitudes or behaviour around a topic. So what I tend to do is try and use models that do that put kind of knowledge, attitudes and behaviour first, and then we think about the kind of demographic side of things. I like a model that's called the situational model of publics, which we could talk about. And you may have come across John Falks' work as well around the museum visitor experience. And we can again sort of touch on some of that later, but those different models, like it's not perfect, these ideas, because people don't like being labeled and put into a box, but what I find it is helpful is it just means I know kind of what people are coming into my experiences for, and therefore I can meet their needs, therefore I can give them a positive experience, and we can have some really effective outcomes. What I like about that concept though is that we mustn't forget that we don't wear the same hat all the time. So with John Falks' model, for example, he describes that there are, so for example, if you were attending a museum or a zoo on your own, you might have this kind of what he calls an explorer identity, where you're there to investigate and find stuff out for yourself. But if you're there with friends and family, you might be wearing a facilitator hat. So they've got those you know, those different identities that you bring into a space or into an experience mean that you have very different needs and therefore very different outcomes that you want to achieve. so I think I just, you know, getting my head under that can be very helpful for evaluation, because we can say, have we understood who's coming through the door? Are they coming through the door? And what have we done for them? And then thinking about those outcomes then for those people, I don't know if you've come across the generic learning outcomes framework, but I find that quite helpful. It's come out of the UK, the museums, libraries and archives. They were looking at what happens in informal learning settings. And what I like about it as a framework is that it talks about learning not just as uptake of knowledge, but it recognises that people might have skills or behaviour, enjoyment, those sorts of things. So when we're thinking about the outcomes that we want to create from our activities, we can then assess those as well. So I find that really helpful. And then just to wrap up in my last minute or so, for me, thinking about evaluation, because it's something that's embedded into what I do, it really starts at the outset of a project. So thinking about good planning, thinking about logic models, thinking about theories of change. And again, we can sort of think about those. So a logic model being a planning tool to say, here's where we are, here's what we're going to do, here's our outputs, the activities we're going to create, here's the outcomes, the changes we want to make, and hopefully some kind of longer term impact. I always used a mixed methods approach, and David Cresswell's great on mixed methods if you want to know that. So that's kind of numbers and stories, you know, you're trying to collect the quantitative and the qualitative. And we could talk about different tools for that perhaps later on. And then the last thing I would just want to end on really is a bit of a note of caution. And I don't know what it's like where you are, but I think we have a temptation here in the UK to try and think about, we create an intervention, we invite people to take part in it, we evaluate it, and then we want to try and track some kind of long-term impact from that intervention that we've created. And that is problematic because it ignores the fact that people have brought a lifetime of experience before they come and take part in our activities, and then it ignores the fact they're going to have a whole other swathe of experiences afterwards. And so I think what I'm keen to think about is how we shift our thinking from the benefit, the impact of our little intervention to how our interventions support people's whole life experience. And Professor Louise Archer at UCL here in London has done a lot of work on something called science capital, which is a kind of idea around the number of people, number of interactions that people have with science builds up their science capital. And the more science capital you have, the more that you think science is relevant and is for me. So those are a few things that I sort of take into account when I'm starting to think about evaluation. And I will stop there and let Jenni have her bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That's a cornucopia of ideas. I'm dazzled by them all, and we'll certainly want to come back and ask you. The one I would like you to, and I'll ask you, this is my first question, but after Jenni's spoken, is this notion of numbers and stories. And so how does that work, the numbers and stories idea? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and now I'll turn over to Jenni Metcalfe, who'll give her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Toss, and thanks, Helen. I'm currently in Perth running a series of workshops, so it's the afternoon here, not the morning, and I see that it's a lot colder than where Helen is in the UK at the moment, which is probably unusual for an Australian-UK comparison. And I'm on the lands of the Wajanoonga people, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, recognising that they've always had connections to the land. I'm going to share my screen and use PowerPoint. So what I wanted to talk about today was that any evaluation needs to have a purpose for doing it. And for me, the three main purposes of evaluation are to check what you're doing as you're doing it, and Helen referred to that as formative evaluation. The second purpose is to collect evidence of how well you're doing or not, and that can happen anytime within a longer program or a series of events, or it can happen at the end in that sort of summative evaluation that Helen also spoke about. But it can also have the ability to create transformational change. And I wanted to talk about 3 stories that showed evidence of that. I've been involved in evaluation for as long as I've been a science communicator, which is now over 32 years. And it's an important part of the way I do practice and the way I do research as well. So the first one is checking what you're doing. A couple of years ago, we were asked by the Queensland government to write 2-page summaries on a whole lot of research that they had done on koalas. And they'd done the research for 5
Jenny, I'm just going to jump in because we can see a presenter view rather than the full slide view.
Oh.
And the writing's a little small.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, so these fact sheets were meant to cater for 5 different groups of people: researchers, policymakers, breeders, rescuers, and veterinary staff. And you can see the 5 little icons we created down the bottom, so that in each fact sheet, we would use those icons to show when that information was relevant to those different types of people. But I was very concerned about putting out these 2-page fact sheets, which summarize very large scientific reports, without knowing whether they actually resonated with the target audiences. And so with the client, we got a sample of people that represented each of those 5 groups: researchers, policymakers, breeders, rescuers of koalas, and veterinary staff. And we sent them a draft of each of the fact sheets that we were developing and asked them to review it and give us feedback. At the end of that, we did substantive revisions to all fact sheets, and they were then much more effective, I think, in meeting the needs of those target audiences. So that is that sort of formative evaluation, that checking what you're doing as you're going. The second example that I wanted to talk about was I was involved in setting up and running a program, a long-term participatory science communication program on climate champion farmers, where a group of about 45 farmers from around Australia interacted with researchers over the course of that time. The main purpose of this program was to have champions, farmers, who could then share that information with other farmers about climate risk in Australia and how to manage that climate risk. And we did regular evaluation as we went along with that program. We did both surveys and interviews. And this is an example. And from my personal point of view, I actually think the anecdote, the quote, is more powerful than the statistic. So the statistic said that 97% found the program helpful or very in supporting their communication with other farmers. But the quote tells about an action that they actually did. I was able to link with a farmers group, provide them with a monthly email of what we were doing, and so on. Did it for 3 years until I ended my involvement with the Climate Champion program. When I saw farmers who were receiving it, they expressed how much they had come to rely on it and help in their decision making, but also that they now knew where to source information for themselves. And to me, that is much more powerful, a series of anecdotes like that, than that single statistic, in showing that, at least to some extent, it appears that the program was achieving what it set out to do. So that was checking as you're going. We did this regularly throughout the program. So the third one, which is about creating change. When I started as a consultant at eConnect Communication some 26 years ago, one of my first consultancies was to go out, and there was a large a research centre in Australia with sites and stakeholders all around the place. It included policymakers, farmers, Indigenous people, people who manage the land and the water and so on. And they were spread across various parts of Australia. And they assigned us to find out how the communication was going. It was about 2 or 3 years into the life of the centre, and they wanted to know how communication was going. We did a mix of interviews and focus groups with all of those people across the country, which meant I got many frequent miles up as we travelled around and interviewed those people. We then got all that information together and synthesised it and evaluated it and produced a report. And that report resulted in the director resigning and the whole centre being revamped. To me, that's an example of transformational change. I haven't been able to replicate that since. That's such a big change, but I think it shows you the power that evaluation can come. And so I think, in summary, it's just very important to consider your purpose and what you want to achieve with your evaluation.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny. Nice slides there. Now, I'm going to ask you in a moment, Jenny, about the practical steps you take. So what's the first thing you do? I'll give you a moment to think about this, but if you were evaluating an event, what's the first thing you do and what are the steps you undertake before you go any further? But Helen, I promised you the question about numbers and stories. Now, that's a wonderful term. So how does that work?
Well, I think Jenny's last, second to last quote there from the Climate Change Champions programme is a perfect example of that, isn't it? That numbers are great, they tell some part of the story, but you've got to have the qualitative, the anecdotes and they're not anecdotes. If you do it properly, it's not anecdotal, but you know the descriptive kind of experience that people have as part of your experiences that you create. So the challenge is always that I find anyway is the powers that be, like the numbers. They want to know that you reached however many people or that this many things were produced or what have you, and numbers are great in that sense, but equally for me that the stories help us get through to the depth of the experience that we've offered and the richness of it, and what that does mean is that we've got to be skilled in the tools that we can use, and perhaps that's what Jenny might be elaborating on in response to the question that you've asked her is we've got to be able to do both, and as evaluators having skills in both quantitative and qualitative, not only methods but the analysis of them can be quite challenging. Okay, so on to Jenny now. This question I asked, so what's the first step you take? Jenny, let's assume that you're evaluating an event that you've got running. What's the first thing you do?
Well, I think before you even start to run the event, you need to have built in your evaluation. And to me, that's a common mistake that's made, is that evaluation isn't built in. And at the end, people go, oh, we should evaluate this. Let's go out and do that. But it's essential to build it in from the start. And it needs to be linked with what the event is trying to achieve. An interesting type of evaluation I saw of a science centre event was that they took photos of the crowd and they analysed how engaged people looked in the crowd, because one of their objectives was to make people more interested in science. And so if they look like they're engaged and involved in doing things, then that was a sign of their success. So they use visual pictures to do their evaluation. So it very much depends on what it is you're hoping to achieve.
Okay, so that's the first. Helen,
just
please
respond to that. Sorry, could I just respond to that? Because that I've got a perfect anecdote for that, and the reason why mixed methods are so important. I'm a real fan of participant observation, which is a bit what you're describing there, Jenny, kind of watching what's going on. And I was doing an evaluation for a pilot event, and the intention was to get people in the audience talking amongst themselves, as well as not just to the kind of experts in the room. And I was busy watching, and I was like, great. And I was keeping a record. Every single person in the room said something to each other. So I was like, this is good. This is all going well, apart from two people who didn't say a word. And I thought, oh dear, these people haven't said anything. So I thought, right, mixed methods 1, participant observation, mixed method 2, do a quick interview. So I went over to this person and I said, oh, I'm Helen, I'm just helping out today, just to see how it went. I'm helping the organizer. I just wondered, how has today's, this evening's event gone for you? Expecting something like, oh, it was terrible, it was boring, that's because they didn't say anything. But actually this person said, do you know, it's been brilliant. I have loved being part of the conversation. And that to me was a real eye-opener, because it's like what I thought being part of a conversation meant would be actually talking. But for this person, it wasn't. It was listening to the conversation and having that conversation around you. And that's why it's so important that you've got to use more than one method to understand what's going on.
You both talk about mixed methods. So what are the methods that you use that you find most helpful? Jenni first.
I think simple is good. At the end of the day, I'm never going to absolutely approve that the Climate Champion program increased farmers' understanding of climate risk around Australia. I'm never going to approve that. So it's important to think about, well, what are the things that can give me an indication of that? And for me, it's very much, I'm a fan of qualitative stuff, but I also like to mix it up with some quantitative stuff too. But the qualitative stuff, the opportunity to tell stories is important. But it can be just as simple at the end of running a workshop, giving people out a card and asking them to write on one side what they liked most about the workshop, and on the other side what they thought could have been done better. And that gives you a qualitative sense of and richness of what you could do. And I think that's an important thing to do. So I'm in Perth at the moment running a series of workshops I haven't run before, which for a client I haven't worked with before. And they're on storytelling. And this is for people involved in marketing and exporting grain. And so we ran the first one yesterday and got some really good feedback. And I've spent most of today revising the workshop based on that feedback. And it was particularly from those two questions that I got the feedback that I needed to revise.
So which were the two questions again?
What worked well and what could be done better next time?
Okay. So Helen, what do you find? I mean, you've mixed this, as I said before, a cornucopia of ideas. But when you come into, you're confronted with the task of doing an evaluation, what are your tried and trusted methods of collecting the feedback that you want?
Yeah. So I will use, I've mentioned already, participant observation, interviews, questionnaires, focus groups. Those are probably the ones that I use most. However,
say those again, please.
Yeah, participant observation, so watching people, interviews. So, but that might only be one or two questions. You know, the example that I gave there, I literally asked that person one question. Still, that would be classed as an interview. Yeah. Questionnaires, but again, not a questionnaire that's like a 10 sheets of, you know, in-depth questions. You know, I did one questionnaire, for example, where we wanted to know if people had the people who were doing the intervention, doing the exhibition, wanted to reach all of Bristol. So I'm based in Bristol in the southwest of England, and all of Bristol, like, you know, with a one-day exhibition, this was quite hard. And so what we ended up doing was, rather than asking people, where have you come from today, or what's your, you know, your postcode kind of thing, we just had a little map of Bristol with all the postcode areas on. We gave them a little sticky dot and said, thanks for coming, it's been really nice to see you here. Could you just put a sticky dot on here to tell us where you've come from today? And they put the sticky dot on. So we had a nice visual representation, and we could see whether we'd reached all of the postcode areas. We didn't quite, but it wasn't bad. But that, I would still class that as a questionnaire. It's still, but it's not done in a way that looks like a questionnaire. So there's definitely something about embedding this stuff into the experience as well. So you're not trying to, you don't want to ruin the experience by creating a terrible evaluation process. You want it to be part of the experience, don't you? And then just the other one was focus groups. So I have done focus groups, and those are a bit more in depth, and you might need to ask people to participate in those and stay on for a bit longer and give them some reward for doing that. But a lot of things that you might see some people doing, like I've done things like mind maps, or getting people to take photographs of their experience as well, but nearly those are always then a prompt for an interview. You know, there are mechanisms. So you'd sit down with the person and say, you've just done this mind map about this XYZ. Can you just tell us a bit about it? What were you doing? Or you took these photographs of your experience. Why was that? What was special about those things? So ultimately, a lot of these things do come down to an interview. It's important to the conversation.
Did you want to add to that list of Helen's about the things that you find useful?
Actually, I thought it was good. People can get quite fancy about evaluation, and it can cost a lot of money. I mean, it's not cheap to run focus groups. I mean, I love focus groups. I think they can be very rich if they're moderated and structured properly. But it can be quite expensive, particularly if you have to pay participants to be involved. That's why I tend to go to the more simple ones. But as Helen said, don't make assumptions. The more different types of evaluation methods that you can slot in, the more you will actually understand the situation.
Okay, now I did say we'll allow quite a lot of time for questions, so I'd invite you, if you do have any questions to ask Helen and or Jenni, please put them in the chat line and we'll turn to them. Soon. I wanted to ask you both, though, a question about one of the more difficult evaluations, and that is when your event, let's say you're trying to persuade the girls of 15 or 16 years old to be more sympathetic to the idea of undertaking science studies in the future. How do you go about evaluating an event there? How do you manage to chart a change of attitude, a change of mind?
Well, I think really evaluating attitudes and behaviour is very, very hard. And sometimes it takes a while for people's attitudes to change, and they're not going to change from a single event. So you can't isolate that event as being pivotal in changing those attitudes, unless you've got an anecdote from a few people who've said that event changed my life, which has happened to me. But you know, that's one or two people who'll tell you that. It generally takes a lot more than that to change attitudes and behaviour. It's an accumulation of activities, events, and programs to do that.
Yeah, and I agree. I completely agree. I mean, obviously, you can ask people how they're feeling at the end of the session. Sorry, but if you ask people if they're feeling more warm to taking up science in the future, of course they're going to say yes. You know, kids are not stupid. They know what you're trying to achieve. So I am, and also if that were a client of mine, I would be saying to them, you're too late. You know, we know all the research shows that that young people decide whether science is for them or not much younger than that. So I'd actually be suggesting that they're probably, you know, if there was chance to change, I'd be saying let's you know, either change the activity or change the target audience, because you're actually a bit too late. And also, I mean, you know, science is quite toxic as an environment, and I am reluctant to persuade young people who are minoritized, to come into science when it's not a safe space for them. And so, you know, I personally spend more of my time trying to change the scientific system so that it is more inclusive and more accessible for people, rather than saying to people, come into this environment that's not great for you. But
now, I'm going to pick up a question that Paul Holper has asked, and that is about the strategic value of science communication. Why is it strategically important for people who are in the science communication game for them to have a good evaluation tool at their disposal? What's the significance of that?
I did write a piece, which I'll share a link actually in the chat, about this, around why evaluation is really important. And it's almost like if you don't do good evaluation, and that's evaluation that's embedded throughout the system, you end up, it's a very high risk that you're going to have got it wrong, and therefore actually there's a risk that you'll have wasted money. And if that's public money, or anyone's money, you know, that's you're wasting people's time and resources. So for me, it's definitely about evidencing the value that we've done, and being transparent about where our funding, you know, has come from and where it's been spent. So I think it's almost, you could say it's unethical to not do evaluation.
Okay, Jenni.
Yeah, it's about the consequences of not doing it. Yes, it can be expensive, as Paul said, but think about that first evaluation study I did. I think the centre then went on to do wonderful things that they may not have ever had the chance to do. And it's by it's by demonstrating value through evaluation that you can really, I think, promote that to people who are having to pay for it. Having said that, I'd give a caution about, I see a lot of evaluation where people put dollar figures on things, like if there's been, you know, so many stories in the media, they'll say that was worth so much in advertising. To me, that means nothing. Likewise, however many people you have in an audience, yeah, you had an attendance, but why did you run this? Was it just to have an attendance, or was it to do something and to create some sort of change? So if you really want to make change, positive change, which I think most research is about, but even if it's a change in knowledge, and you want communication to be part of that, then you really need to evaluate it. And some examples to demonstrate the value and benefit of it can really help.
Sometimes, I mean, in my experience as a science communicator, sometimes the most skeptical people are the people who run the institutions where I'm doing the evaluation. I put on an event, I run an evaluation, and they're the ones that need persuading. I mean, why are we diverting good money from research into running events to persuade people out there? Is that a significant factor in your thinking?
I think you're asking that you can use evaluation to persuade people that these events are important. Is that right?
Well, it's people who have to pay for the event. I mean, I get it's. So I was at a division of CSIRO, and we would run a public event, and then the boss of the CSIRO unit would be slightly sceptical about the whole thing. And I think the evaluation, a good evaluation, is one way of persuading that person that it was worthwhile.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yeah, that's the sort of case study I'm talking about it as well.
And if
showing
evaluation,
that,
think about evaluation, it's not just for, you know, we can often think, oh, well, we need to tell, you know, the funders, for example, you know, that we've spent their money wisely, but it's good for the team as well, and it's good for you as practitioners, because you can say, hey, you know, look what we put on, look what we did, this was great, we did really, really well, or actually we did great, but a couple of things that we need to change there next time. So it's useful personally and professionally. As practitioners, we should be finding evaluation useful, as well as it being a tool for advocacy for what we do. So there is a lot of, you know, and there's a couple of questions in the chat, the challenge of demonstrating the long-term impact of the work that we do, and it's hard, right? So, so I do think we have to, you know, take all of the evidence that we can. And I, you know, just to give you an example, so I worked on an exhibition where we did a lot of formative evaluation to get to develop each exhibit, and each exhibit, it was a £1.5 million exhibition, so each exhibit was about 20k, and some of the formative work we did there meant that they created it really shifted the content and the style of the exhibit that we'd got planned. If we hadn't done that formative work, we'd have created exhibits that were meaningless to the visitors that were coming through the door, and we'd have wasted that money. So it really is important to you can't afford not to do it.
So you're now talking about evaluation as you go, which would have the effect of changing what you're doing and changing behaviours, changing the nature of exhibits and performances. And then there's evaluation at the end where you test how you went. So do you separate those two evaluations out? Okay, I see you nodding wisely. Let's turn to some questions. So we've got, let's see, what's Matthew Wood say? How can you comment on how clients, funders, organisers tend to respond to qualitative measures of impact? Do they generally take it on board, or are they interested in quantitative measures? So Helen first, qualitative or quantitative, or a mix?
It's people, funders, they like a good number. You know, and even if you've said we're going to reach 10 people, and those 10 people are going to have a really in-depth experience and it's going to be transformative, if you were able to say, actually, we reached 100 people, they'd probably be happier. But that's, you know, and it's this problem, isn't it, that quantitative stuff quantitative data is perceived as higher value than qualitative, and that is not just unique to evaluation, that's unique to research, it's unique to policy making. It's a really common issue. So, you know, I trained as a scientist, I trained as a biologist and physicist, and my PhD was entirely qualitative. So I'm a total convert from the quant to the qual, and it's a great frustration of mine. So which is why you need the numbers and the stories. You know, you've got to have them both together.
Look, this is the little phrase I'm taking away from this conversation: numbers and stories. So a question from Elena Nib, and that is, more and more science communication is occurring online or on social media. I've seen digital agencies popping up that offer services to measure online engagement. Any tips for how to do meaningful evaluation, getting both the numbers and the stories, online for online science communication, i.e. on social media platforms? Oh, and now Larota Mabar says she's seen Poll, P-O-L-L, working well for online events. Would you all agree with that? So maybe you could address those two questions, please.
I wouldn't call myself a digital communication expert, and I'm sure there's others that could talk about that in evaluation. But there's certainly lots of great tools out there to evaluate numerically how you're going. But I still think it needs other research to look at how you're going in a qualitative sense. So it's easy to get numbers on digital success, and they're important. And some of the numbers are more important than others, like how long does someone spend on a page of a website, for example, seems to indicate that they've got, you know, they're engaging with the site. And how many times do people move to another site and never come back? Those sort of things give you a sense of the quality and the type of engagement they're having. But I still think finding out from the users of those sites directly, nothing can beat that, really.
Yeah, I agree, and it's definitely not my area of expertise, but when I see how social media experts describe their kind of their impact and their reach, they use very different indicators of what success looks like. So there are terms like impressions and views and appearance in timelines, and some of those numbers are very impressive, but they, you know, it literally means someone scrolls past your post on, you know, on Twitter, and I just think, okay, it's an indicator, but it doesn't demonstrate, it doesn't tell you what the person has taken away from scrolling past your tweet. And so you can do things like sentiment analysis as well, but again, not my area of expertise. But I think if I were doing anything online, I would say that sort of information around how things have been spread through Twitter or Instagram or what have you, they're part of the narrative, but they're not the only thing, unless you were doing an initiative that was entirely focused on Instagram or that social media account. So if you're doing an engagement activity that was specifically about, you know, engaging people with nature through Instagram, for example, then you'd be able to do you'd get some facts and figures about it, and you'd be able to, you know, do some analysis of the text and the comments and what people are saying they're doing. So you could still use some of those sort of standard analysis techniques, but it's yeah, I struggle a little bit with some of that.
Okay, let's turn to a question from Daria, and she asks, can I ask what is your opinion about the interplay between psychom research and psychom evaluation? What makes an evaluation good enough to be considered a research, and where do you draw the line? Okay, Jenni, now look, you're a recent PhD in science communication. You must have this answer right at your fingertips.
It was a while ago now, Charles. Just so you know, COVID happened since then. Yeah, that was an interesting question, because I know initially when I was writing up some of my research, my supervisor said, it's sounding like evaluation. Don't do it like that. And you know what? I can't remember what I did to change it. But I think maybe I put some literature around it and compared it with other things, and then it suddenly became research. yes, that certainly can be a critique of someone like myself, who's a practitioner who evaluates, who then goes into research, and it looks just like evaluation. And I think, yeah, it's about taking on the bigger literary field that's around that area, I think, to make it research. But I think Helen would probably know way better than me.
Tell you what distinction I make. So research is about the generation of new knowledge. And so if you're doing research, you're generating new ideas, new hypotheses, new concepts, that sort of thing. So research is new knowledge. Evaluation is testing out whether you've done the thing that you said you were going to do. And for me, that's the distinction. And in the university where I work, there's and in other universities where I've worked, there's a distinction between research and evaluation, because because evaluation basically is unlikely to lead to new knowledge. It's unlikely to lead to, for example, it being sufficiently robust and interesting and to be able to get a peer review paper out of it, for example. And then that sort of responds to, I think there's a question further on about the sort of ethics and of data collection as well. So quite often with evaluation, yes, I will always get consent and I will always, do all of those things. But if you're going to publish in a peer review paper, you have to have gone through very rigorous consent and approval and data security and all of those sorts of things. So it is, as I think the distinction is blurred, but there are some boundaries.
Okay, from Erin. Erin asks, and she refers to something you said, Helen, that it can be difficult to measure impact, as you'd need to follow up with participants sometime later. And as Jenni said, evaluations can be expensive. And so Erin's question, any suggestions as to how we can measure long-term impact / changes in attitude, behaviours that are simply, the behaviour that are simpler or less expensive? So how do you go about measuring long-term impact or changes in attitude without spending a lot of money?
I think we don't do enough longitudinal studies, and there's rarely any money for it. I would love to go back. I mean, the Climate Champion program finished 6 years ago. I would love to go back and find out what's happened now as a result of that program. Are they still doing things? Are they still in networks? Are they still having a relationship with the scientists? But who's going to fund me to do that? So I think it's a good question, and I think it's something that's lacking in both the practice and research of science communication, that longitudinal study to look at things. And it would be wonderful if we could find some funding to fund some of those longitudinal studies to look at those long-term impacts. Another area I'd love to know is that, Toss, you and I have been running communication skills workshops for scientists for 30 years, anniversary in August this year. Even 10 years on, what are they doing with that training? Or 5 years on, what are they doing with it? But don't have the time or the money to find out, but it'd be fascinating.
Well, there was another workshop we did, and that was a study we did on that was evaluating is communication an impediment or an incentive to scientists as far as their careers are concerned? And that'd be lovely to do. I mean, that's now 25 years old. It'd be lovely to do a follow-up to that. But let's turn to one of the other ones. Please.
Could I just offer another little reflection on that? Because I think there's a case for our funders. So our funders who fund short-term interventions or even 2 or 3 year projects, they don't then give us the funding to then do that follow-up work a few years down the line. There's also, certainly in the UK, there's a real tendency to fund relatively small pilot projects with very little funding for anything more substantial and long term. So the funding landscape certainly in the UK is not great for that sort of that longer term thing. The other thing I would also suggest though is that we have a survey that's done periodically called the Public Attitudes to Science Survey, and so we can use that as a that is changing over time, it's done periodically, and we can put our interventions into that narrative, you know, and say, well, actually, you know, I did this particular initiative, the people at the time who were taking part in it said that they felt X, Y, Z, and oh look, if we look at the public attitudes to science survey, that corresponds with the change. So we could say we're kind of contributing to that kind of broader societal level change. But it's a bit tenuous. It's a bit tenuous, you know, but it's very hard. It's like I said, you know, at the very beginning, that actually our interventions are, we shouldn't be trying to track, unless we're doing really substantial interventions, that actually it's people's lives that are the important bit, and how our interventions and experiences kind of contribute to that, rather than what's the long-term impact of our initiative, because people's lives are complex and they've had so much other stuff that's come before and after. So it's very hard. It's almost arrogant, isn't it, to say, you know, you visiting my science festival has changed your life. It's like, it's not going to have done that, is it? And for us to have been able to get that the influence of that visit to a science centre or a festival or whatever, you know, from the noise of someone's life, yeah, I'm not sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so Jude has asked, doing science communication, say on concepts like genetic modification, is quite hard. How do you assess people's understanding of these issues in a simple way? This word simple has resonated with our audience. I can see that. Okay, Jenny, so how do you assess people's understanding of genetic modification or other complicated concepts in a simple way?
I never really want to know those things, but having said that, I have worked with clients who want to increase the understanding of some complex technical idea, or some sort of understanding of the world. And so one way that you can devise are survey questions, which the responses of will tell you what their understanding is. And when I do those, I like to do a before and after. So before they do these sort of interventions, what's the understanding of genetic modification based on a series of survey questions? And then afterwards, has that changed? So that's one way of doing it.
Jenny, you talked about, sorry, I'll come back to you, Helen, in a minute. Jenny, you talked about workshops and courses you've run, and you've run hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, but you quite often send out a survey before the workshop starts. And so you're going to run a one-day workshop on presentation or on telling stories or on media skills. What sort of questions do you ask people to respond to, and how does that influence the nature of the workshops? And then Helen, I'll come back to you in a minute.
Well, my number one principle in science communication is understand who you're communicating with. And so obviously that goes for running workshops as well. So I want to know who they are, what their research area is, who they communicate with. So who are their target audiences or groups, and what they want to get out of the workshop. So a list of options and lots of spaces to write other. They're the sort of core questions that I ask beforehand. And then there may be specific ones based on the sort of workshop that I'm running. So like for in media skills, I might ask what sort of media they most want to use. Is it online, newspaper, radio, television, or some form of social media? So yeah, they're the sort of questions that I ask beforehand, and that very much shapes the sort of workshop we run.
Okay, so back to you, Helen. I'm sorry I cut you off a minute ago.
It's okay. It's just about the sort of complex science topics that sometimes, you know, we're engaged with, the menstruous GM stuff. But I think it's worth remembering that for many people, they may not have even thought about it. So actually, if we ask people their opinion about something or what they know about it, they may not have thought about it. And so there's a whole tranche of kind of engagement work that's around deliberation, and that's about helping people make sense of something and be able to understand it. So I would definitely always advocate for a kind of deliberative process for some people to help them make sense of something that's complicated or complex. And then the second one, just to illustrate another point. So when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at public engagement with climate change, and I was looking at the literature, and all of the stuff that was there was basically questionnaire based, and asking people if they knew technical aspects of climate change. So for example, which of these are greenhouse gases? What's the temperature rise going to be? None of it let the voice of the public through. And so there was nothing that was qualitative. There was nothing that was talking that I could read that helped me understand how members of the public are feeling about climate change. And so that's how I ended up going down the route of doing something that was very qualitative, because there was just this massive gap in the literature. And I think
so Helen, sorry if I can interrupt. So what sort of questions do you think did you ask, or what sort of questions do you think these people should have been asking, these researchers?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's one thing to ask people if they know about the technical aspects of climate change, but that doesn't tell you anything about what they're doing in response to it, or how they're feeling about it, and therefore what policy decisions we should be taking, and those sorts of things. So, just because someone might know that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, that doesn't mean they're going to do anything to become more pro-environmental, for example. So it was sort of, for me, it was understanding. So I was asking them how they feel about climate change. What do they know about it? How do they act in response to what they know about climate change? And it was fascinating. You get a much richer experience when people don't see climate change in isolation. They see it in a broader context of kind of social justice and the economy and all of these things. And so to ask people just survey questions about is CO2 or methane the worst greenhouse gas? It tells us nothing. Or very little.
Okay, I want to go back to the question Paul Holper asked. And he said, evaluation can be expensive. Any tips for persuading the client that the additional cost is going to be worthwhile for them? And I think this question also applies to the superior officers within a science organisation as well. So how do you persuade people that evaluation is useful?
I thought we'd sort of already touched on this, but I've popped a link in the chat, which is a little paper I wrote with a colleague.
Yes.
It's quite a few years ago now, but essentially it's making the case for front-end formative and summative evaluation, and saying you can't afford not to do it, because otherwise you run the risk of not, you run the risk of not doing the work right, and you run the risk of not spending money appropriately, and you need to be accountable, and all of those things that we talked about earlier.
Jenni, anything?
Yeah, I think it's about demonstrating the value of evaluation, and even if you do it off your own bat in a small way, and you then show that it's important, then that can help persuade them as well. But why invest in money in something if you don't know if it's going to work or not? That's the basic question.
It's definitely, and it also doesn't have to be hugely expensive. Like I say, if you can kind of embed it into your principles and practice and how you work, actually it can be, it's just part of what you do, and so that can make it a bit cheaper. And yes, there is a value in having an external evaluator, but you might use an external for particular pieces of work. But while you're developing something and running something for the first time, I think quite a lot of reflective practice is sufficient to be able to do what you need to do and to inform your practice. But yeah, you might need an external if you're then rolling out at scale, but in which case then you would cost that into that project.
Okay, last question.
I would add to that. I think one of the reasons why people don't fund evaluation is because it's separated out from the program. Build it in, make it part of the program, and then it's funded with the program. It's not a separate thing. Don't make it separate. Make it part of whatever it is you're doing.
Thank you very much. Now, Helen has posted a link to that paper. She talked about evaluation as a strategic management tool in the chat. Last question, and Helen, you did mention this as well, and this was ethical considerations in evaluation. So I'll give you a minute each, Helen, to address this and also to wrap up. Helen first, then Jenni.
The short answer is yes. You do need consent, and yes, you do need to do all of those things and keep people's data secure. So and it's becoming harder and harder. So like in the university where I am now, anything that an academic does is considered research and therefore has to go through the ethics process, and all data has to be, you know, collected and held and manipulated in a robust way. So so yeah, anything is, and yes, so, you know, if I'm doing things, I take your photographs, yeah, then yeah, what I'll do is I'll probably say to someone, can I take your photograph, please, you know, and then I'll show them it. This draws the digital camera, so I'll say, look, this is the photo, is it okay if I use that now? And I'll take a note of the number, and they'll sign to say yes, that they're happy for that to be used. So it doesn't have to be a long and laborious process. I think consent is not tricky, but you do need to do it.
Okay, Jenni, a final wrap.
Yeah, I think organisation and universities have quite rigid ethics processes, which are quite rightly so. But can I say that when you're evaluating and you're consulting people often, I think it's two things. It's important to be respectful, regardless of whether you have to follow any set ethics. Respectful, and secondly, I think it's polite to feed back the results of your evaluation to those people that you consulted, and it's people often forget that. So respectful, polite feedback, and I think that's an important part of evaluation.
Colette, I've forgotten, were you going to introduce those two final questions right at the end about what did they find new and exciting, or was I going to do that, or were you going to do that?
I'm happy to do the evaluation for it.
Good on you. Oh, we have to have an evaluation, I think.
Yes, so we're going to role model one way to do an online evaluation, and what we'd like you to do is in the chat put down one thing new that you've learnt today, something new that you're going to take away from what we've done today, and then also something practical that you're going to do in either setting up evaluation or evaluating your next event. And just drop it into the chat. We want to collect it, and also so that everyone else can kind of see it.
Thank you very much, Colette. All right, now I'm going to wrap the session up. We've gone an hour. It's been terrific. It's been a wonderful, lively discussion. And I'd like to thank Helen Featherstone and Jenni Metcalfe very much for being such willing participants and throwing out so many ideas. I am glad to say that the organisers of this event, Australian Science Communicators, the Canberra branch, did record it, and we will post information about how you can access the recording after the event over. So, all right, well, it's all about numbers and stories, as Alison Kershaw has just reminded me. Wonderful stuff. Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Jenni. Thank you, Colette. And thank you, Ask ACT. And I wish you all good morning, good evening, or good night.
Great. Thanks.
Give you all a few minutes to put your evaluations in for us.
Okay.
So I'm happy to leave it open for a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, you can leave it open. Okay, good. Terrific.
And always happy. If anyone wants to follow up or ask me anything else, you can drop me a line. So yeah.
Yeah, it'll be all available soon.
Oh, here's a nice comment by Alana Nib. Really valuable to hear that it's arrogant to presume my event can change an attitude or behaviour, and the person's noisy life is too big to even distill that info out of. Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant.
Yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to shut us all down, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, great. Okay, lots of thanks coming in. Thanks to everyone in the audience. It was really nice talking to you today, and thanks once again, Helen and Jenni. I'll see you later.